Now recording, and I'm now going to share my screen. Holy moly! Yay! And now I'm going to broadcast. Hello, everyone. I see some people are still joining, so we're going to wait for everyone to finish joining before we get going. Welcome to the Pastor Panel on Race and Racism. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm seeing the participant count climb up, so I'm just sort of treading water here until I see it stop climbing to know that everyone's in. Here we go. We'll be starting in just another moment or two once we're sure everybody who wants to be in is in. Super. All right, let's get started. My name is Reverend Deb Clifford. I'm the deacon at Simsbury United Methodist Church, and I'll be moderating our panel discussion tonight, our pastor panel on race and racism. So before we get started, let me just walk through a little bit of what you might expect this evening. Right now, we're on the welcome and guidelines, and I will in a moment explain to you what's different between a Zoom webinar and what you're used to when we do Zoom worship, which is a Zoom meeting. Then each panelist will speak to us for about 15 minutes, and we will listen to what they have to say. They've prepared some thoughts for us, and afterwards, we'll have a chance for Q&A. You can enter questions at any time during the time that the panelists are speaking, or you can wait until they're done. We're going to entertain the questions after everyone is finished speaking. So you can submit those questions by clicking on the Q&A button. I'm going to give you a chance to test that in just a second. Then we'll end with some closing thoughts and a prayer from Pastor Jean. And I did want to make mention that we will make available to you a post-session survey for you to fill out so that we can continuously improve these webinars and education sessions and things that we do at Simsbury United Methodist. So let me, before I get into the guidelines, also let you know something else that we've planned for you. We just put the finishing touches on this, but next week at this same time, from 7 to 8 on next Tuesday night, July 14th, we have contracted with an organization called the National Conference for Community and Justice. You can look them up on nccj.org. And they are going to offer another webinar to continue our journey, deepening our understanding of race and racism. And it'll be titled A Shared Understanding. So just like when we went on our journey about human sexuality, we started out with a pastor panel, and then we followed up with, a session that helped us know a little bit more of the terms and the definitions and the history. That is what they will be presenting for us next week at this time. There'll be more information coming out on the messenger, including a link for you to get to that webinar. So a few of the guidelines. You've already noticed that you can't speak on this Zoom webinar. You've been muted and there is not a chat. Zoom webinars are meant for more large group types of learning events, which we intend for this and next week's to be, versus Zoom meetings, which is how we hold Zoom church. And of course, we want to see everybody and chat with everybody before we start and use breakout rooms afterwards to have coffee time. So the difference is you can see only the panelists in a webinar instead of seeing each other. And the interaction level is different. There's no chatting and no speaking. The only folks who have a microphone are the panelists. You can, however, give questions to us, which we will, as I said, will moderate and facilitate that after the panelists are through. Who's been invited to this? Just us, the SUM community. We are recording it so that it can be replayed, or anyone who might have missed it can hear it. And I want to talk to you a little bit now about how the Q&A will work. There's two ways to ask a question. If you open up the Q&A button and simply type in a question, we will see who asked the question. Your name will appear next to it. If, however, you open up the Q&A and you click the choice that says anonymous, you can ask your question anonymously. we wanted to give you this opportunity to ask whatever's on your mind, even if you think, well, maybe I shouldn't ask this, or maybe I should know this, or for whatever reason, we want you to be able to ask it anonymously, but you do have to remember to click the option to make sure your question is asked anonymously. We're going to be grouping the questions as they come in so that we can have some sort of organization to how we present them to the panelists. And we'll get to that, as I said, after each of the three panelists have spoken. And we'll be saving them as well so that we can have the ones that perhaps we didn't get a chance to answer and have a way to address them at some later date. So before we get started, let's test the Q&A feature. Maybe you have a question about anything that I just said, about next week's webinar, about how to ask a question, or maybe you just want to test and say, this is a test, just to make sure you know how to ask a question anonymously. So if you'll take a moment and click on the Q&A button and simply type in a question and then press enter, I'll see that the Q&A feature is working. We've got an anonymous person saying test, thank you. Okay, a lot of test. That's good, it's working. Thank you for offering this. I'm here. All right, awesome. So since I'm not seeing any real questions, but thank you for helping me make sure that that worked. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that all you're seeing are the panelists and myself. And give you a quick introduction. I'm sure everybody here knows these people, but since we're recording this and who knows who will watch it years from now, I'm gonna give them a quick introduction and then have them go. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak to us this evening. So first we have Reverend Gene Ott, current lead pastor at Simsbury United Methodist Church, a member of the executive committee of the New York Annual Conference, and my ministry partner. Hi, Gene.
Hey, Deb. How are you? Good to be with you.
Good. Next, we have Reverend Mel Kawakami, retired former pastor of Simsbury United Methodist, as well as Newtown United Methodist, and a former member of the executive committee of the New York Annual Conference Board of Ordained Ministry, and Mimi behind him. So, welcome, Mel.
Thanks for having us.
And finally, Dennis Winkleblack, retired pastor as well, former assistant to the bishop, former United Methodist Church district superintendent, and a former member also of the New York Annual Conference Board of Ordained Ministry. That's the order in which they're going to go. I don't want to take up any more time from them. They'll each speak to us in that order for about 15 minutes. And again, you can type in questions while you're listening, but we'll address them only after everyone is done. So I'm going to disappear and just hang out in the background and let you guys do your thing. So thank you.
Thanks, Deb. It is good to be with you tonight. And we've got important work to do. Some of you may be wondering, why is it that we thought it was important to get the three of us together again? We were together about a year ago, and we met with you in Wesley Hall. And of course, we can't do that now. So my sincere thanks to Deacon Deb for figuring out how to augment our Zoom capabilities and to make this possible so that you can ask questions, you can be open, you can be honest, and we can all take this journey together. The first thing that I want to say is one of the reasons why we're doing this is because of the times that we're living through. We're living through really interesting and in a large way unparalleled times. The other reason why we're doing this is because some of us, pastors, lay leaders, church council chairs, received a letter from Bishop Bickerton on the 26th of June. In this, he outlines his expectations for each one of us in the annual conference. He outlines the need to be in dialogue, the need to learn more, the need to not just pray and to think good thoughts, but to actively move towards a greater understanding of what racism is, how we can resist it, and what, in fact, being anti-racist is, and what that journey would look like for not just us as pastors, not just as lay leaders or church council chairs, but as lay people, all of us committed to the United Methodist Church, what it stands for, and the communities that we live in and the people that make that up. That's a large part of why we're here. It's not the only part, but I wanted you to understand that Bishop Bickerton has been unequivocal in his belief that the pandemic of racism, in many ways, perhaps in all ways, is as serious as the pandemic of COVID-19. And it requires just as much care and attention from us as wearing masks and social distancing. And so that's why we're here tonight. Now, the thing about talking about racism, anti-racism, and so many other pieces, which you'll hear tonight from my fellow panelists, which I'm really excited to be and to hear with along with you, is that as Methodists, one of the places where we need to start as we talk about what's going on in our world is who we are. Where do we come from? What has happened in the Methodist Church? Have we been complicit? Have we been completely clean in the matter? Where are we? What's in the closet for us? And how do we understand that so that we can move forward? Now, I'd love to tell you that everything has been just fantastic for the entire history of the United Methodist Church. But earlier, as Methodists, Methodist Episcopals, we've got some stories to tell. Many of you know that I am a great lover of history, with multiple generations of family in the annual conference. And so for me, the history of the church helps to inform our present reality and how we move forward. And so what I want to do is I want to walk you through some significant events in our history so that you can better understand who we are, where our problem areas may be, and then talk a little bit about what the church has to say about racism today beyond Bishop Bickerton's letter. Okay? So follow along. If you were one of those people who hated a history class, I promise I'll make this as interesting as I possibly can. I'll move it along. There's no test, but there are some really important dates that I want you to be aware of as we move through this. The first date is 1773, and this guy, John Wesley, who you may have heard of, and he printed a pamphlet entitled Thoughts Upon Slavery, in which he decried the evils of slavery and called for slave traders and owners to repent and free their slaves. That was a huge, big deal at that time. In 1773, the triangle trade was still in effect. Black Africans were still being taken from Africa and being brought to this country and being put to work on plantations and farms. And this was a business every bit as reputable in some areas and according to some people as any other kind of business. But Wesley was against it. The other thing, and this is a great start, is that at the same time, colonists and later citizens in what became the state of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia were having conversations about how people worshiped and where they worshiped. And in 1794, Richard Allen, who was a former slave, protested that the worship services of the church that he was attending, the Methodist Episcopal Church that he was attending in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had become segregated. That is to say, that the ground floor was reserved for those who were white, and the upper gallery was reserved for those who were not. And in protest, he and a number of other members of that church left and formed a new congregation, which became the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, which is still in effect today. He was their founder. He was their first bishop and leader and was ordained by Francis Asbury, who many of us will recognize in our own Methodist history. And so from that time forward, Methodist Episcopals, now the United Methodists, and the AME folks have traveled side by side, sometimes partnering together, sometimes working together, but we start from this place, but a disagreement about who will worship where and why, and it devolved to skin color. Now, the other thing that you need to understand about Methodism that's kind of interesting, at least to somebody like me, and I hope to somebody like you, is that what has happened in the Methodist Church is often mirrored by what happens in the country, but we have moved a little ahead in many of these areas. So it was in 1840 that we got together, and there was a bishop in Georgia who, through marriage, had inherited slaves. This was a problem for some. This was just another day of doing business for others. But in 1840, 21 years before shots were fired over Fort Sumter, beginning the American Civil War, the Methodist Episcopal Church split over the issue of whether or not it was okay to own other human beings. Became the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And those two institutions, through the course of the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the 1890s, through the First World War, into the Great Depression, would remain separate entities with their own polity, with their own ways of doing business, with completely separate tracts and pastorates, although they shared some common bodies, ways to do mission work, for example. It was not until 1939, on the cusp of the US's involvement in the Second World War. I want you to think about that. This happened 21 years before the Civil War, and it took until just before the Second World War for them to come back together, to form one church again. But there was a problem. The Methodists in the North, during that time, had adopted and had brought into their fold pastors of color. This simply would not work for those who had been in the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And so a deal was made once again to segregate clergy and congregations into what was called the central jurisdiction. All pastors of color would be required to serve in the central jurisdiction. Only white pastors would be allowed to serve in the Methodist Episcopal Church. This was in 1939. And though there would be a lot of conversation about this, that rule would remain in effect until 1968, when the Methodist Episcopal Church and the United Brethren joined together to form the United Methodist Church. And as a condition of that joining from the United Brethren, the central jurisdiction was abolished in that form. Now you may be wondering, with thinking about that, all of those dates, 1773, 1794, and 1839, and 1968, well, what's going on today? Where do we stand as a church today? Well, I want to tell you a little bit about that. After the history lesson, I want to bring you up to the present time. These are words from the United Methodist website. There is a campaign currently underway called the United Methodists Stand Against Racism. And it is written, racism has long been described as America's original sin. The 2020 killings of 3 African Americans, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who died at the hands of police, and Ahmaud Arbery, chased and shot to death by 2 individuals, sparked a national outcry against white supremacy, institutional racism, and it's a protest that has spread globally. You know this. You've seen this. What you may not know is that United Methodist Church leaders and members have joined those voices. The denomination's Council of Bishops, Bishop Bickerton sits on there, and there are other bishops from around the Methodist Church, have called every United Methodist to name, quote, the egregious sin of racism and white supremacy, and join together to take a stand against the oppression and injustice that is killing persons of color. What does the United Methodist Church say about racism? Our social principles, which outline our positions on nearly every issue that exists in society, from abortion to divorce to the environment to, yes, racism, state that racism manifested as sin plagues and hinders our relationship with Christ, inasmuch as it is antithetical to the gospel itself. And so we commit as a church to move beyond symbolic expressions and representative models that do not challenge unjust systems of power and access. The church recognizes the existence of white privilege as an underlying cause of inequality. It supports the concept of affirmative action to guarantee more opportunities. It opposes racial profiling, mass incarceration, targeting of migrants, and sentencing that disproportionately penalizes people of color. It also recognizes that racism, tribalism, and xenophobia is a global problem, and it calls members everywhere to oppose such practices. The church further affirms that, quote, all peoples and individuals constitute one human family, rich in diversity. We recognize that religion, spirituality, and belief can contribute to the promotion of the inherent dignity and worth of the human person and to the eradication of racism. Friends, this is in our bones and our DNA. These are words that have been written by our leaders, by learned people in our own organization who have taken a look at the underlying problems and have decided that this is a chart that we not only should, but that we must set forth on. And so for me to sit here tonight and to be talking to you about where we have come and where we are going is a personal journey. To think about Paul's words that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, means that we need to examine ourselves as a body, as people, and to understand that through the grace and love of Jesus Christ, we are all set free to be who we are, and that we cannot, we may not, we must not continue in the same way. Now, the other thing that means is that we are all of us at different points. We have imbibed much conversation over the last month or two about this, perhaps over the course of our lives. And so this will not be easy. I reflected today that over my 2 full years with you, we have tackled having a new pastor, which is difficult, saying goodbye to a beloved pastor, which is difficult, dealing with human sexuality and gender identity, which is difficult, a global pandemic where we have been unable to get together, 2 stewardship campaigns, ably handled by Pete Gailey, but which are never easy, and now this, conversations about racism. And so I am so pleased to be here with you tonight, so proud to be able to sit with you as we journey together as a church. I don't profess to have all the answers. I don't pretend to be perfect. I'm fully aware that as a white man in this country, I have been richly blessed and I have some things to answer for. And so I am glad to be on this journey with you, and I am more than thrilled to be on this journey with 2 colleagues. 2 colleagues who will tell you more about personal stories, their views on this, and how we take what our church's history is and what our church's present reality and our country and our world, and maybe what we begin to do about it as people. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, Gene. I appreciate your opening remarks, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Dennis. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you this evening on my experience. On the 4th of July, the New York Times ran a full page of the Declaration of Independence. And just reading through it, I could see what a wonderful, marvelous, and aspirational document that was. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, so already we find a tripping point, that all men were created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator and with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I think what Gene was alluding to and what we know now as we look back, as inspiring as these words are, our lived-in reality is a different reality. So I share with you tonight as what I'll call a hyphenated American, a Japanese American, an Asian American, a Christian American, struggling around the hyphen with the ongoing issues of equality, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of faith, and where racism appears to be baked into our American society. And while in no way can I claim full insight into the Black or brown or Native experience, I can share with you what it's like being a visibly identifiable minority in these United States. After the Civil War, as early as 1870, less than 100 years after those soaring words of the Declaration of Independence were written, Congress passed a Naturalization Act. The Chinese had been coming from China onto the West Coast, alarming a number of people, enough so that they passed this Naturalization Act, which made Asians ineligible for citizenship, for voting rights, and the ability to own land. Just less than 12 years after that, Congress actually passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then stopped Chinese immigration. Well, then there was still a need for cheap labor. And on the West Coast, people turned to Asia. And indeed, they recruited Japanese for cheap labor. That's how my grandfathers came over. One worked in the pineapple fields and the sugarcane fields in Hawaii, and then came to California, worked for a while on the railroads, and ultimately settled in San Jose. But in 1924, they passed the Asiatic Exclusion Act, and the Asiatic Exclusion League formed to develop this act, which stopped all immigration except for marriages, stopped all immigration in 1924. So here were the Chinese and the Japanese. They were basically stranded on the West Coast. But those who came made the best of it as possible. And in fact, oftentimes the Japanese would take little farmlands that the white farmer, the Anglo farmers didn't want, would develop those farmlands into truck farms. And were so successful at it, by World War I, went on to produce more than half of the fruits and vegetables consumed in World War I. That did not, however, escape the attention of the California Farm League and the Sons and Daughters of the Golden West. So that once Pearl Harbor happened in December 7th, 1941, they saw this as an opportunity. So when Roosevelt set forth the Executive Order number 9066 on February 19th, 1942, it excluded all Japanese from the West Coast. And the California Farm League, the Sons and Daughters of the Golden West, saw this as the opportunity to scoop up the lands developed by Japanese farmers, which they did oftentimes 10 cents on the dollar. So here the people are 120,000 people of Japanese descent, nearly half of whom are American citizens, were removed from the West Coast and placed in 10 relocation camps. There they spent the duration of the war until the war was over and they could move back. Some of them had nothing to move back to. Others, like my grandfather, had some land that was in my father's name. And so they were able to come back to something. And that something was Japantown in San Jose, California. My grandfather developed a storefront where my aunt and uncle ran a shoe repair store. My father opened an optometry practice. My mother and my aunt ran a beauty salon next to my dad, and my uncle had a dry cleaner next door to them. My uncle was the mailman on the route, and another uncle ran a drugstore down the street. So I grew up in a tight-knit community. I used to say I couldn't throw a rock on my way home from school without my mother hearing about it before I got home. I grew up in the local Methodist church. It was a Japanese Methodist church, and it was fascinating because our office was on Jackson Street, between 4th and 5th. So if you walked down Jackson Street, you turned right, you would end up at the Buddhist church, half block down. If you walked down and turned left, there would be the Methodist church, and again, a half a block down. The cross on the top of the Methodist church was dedicated to my paternal grandfather. But even the Japanese Methodist church was segregated as part of that central jurisdiction that Jean was talking about. As people of color, pastors itinerated in the 12 Japanese Methodist churches sprinkled throughout the West. Now, as a Japanese growing up in Japantown, I think post-war, the great thrust was to be a model minority. And what did that mean? It usually meant trying to integrate as much as possible into the community. So what my parents did was move from San Jose in the middle of Japantown out into an Anglo neighborhood. So I went from being one of probably 40 or 50% of a school that was Japanese, the rest was Hispanic, into a place where I was one of only 2 Japanese. And that was quite an experience. I can remember my folks asking the realtor to poll our new neighbors to find out whether they would have any objections to a Japanese family moving into the neighborhood. And of course, there was the kind of racial taunting that kids, even still today, would go through, the slanted eyes and the Ching Chong Chinaman. That was still a part of the school experience. And I recently heard from Korean nieces that even 30 years later, they were still experiencing some of the very same kinds of taunting. That kind of recognition and reminder of being different, of being a visibly identifiable minority was simply a part of life. In college, I had a door slammed in my face by a guy who said, "I'm not going to rent to Japs." Again, not an uncommon experience. In fact, there were anti-miscegenation laws that were on the books when Dorothy and I got married, that were some of which weren't overturned until the late 70s. And those anti-miscegenation laws were laws against interracial marriages. I can even remember coming as a new pastor, newly minted, coming to Simsbury, excited about my new position as an associate with Caroline Berninger, in fact, and having someone who is now of good heart that I know didn't necessarily mean it this way, but said, "Wow, your English is really good. Did you learn that at Harvard?" Again, it's just that simple reminder of differentness, of otherness, of being visibly identifiable as different. And there is really no way of escaping that. So in February 19th, 1976, there was a proclamation that ultimately ended that Roosevelt's executive order. So it only took 30 years. And then in the Civil Rights Act of 88 and 89, we had all rights restored. And so my grandfather could actually become a citizen grandparents could finally become citizens. And in 1990, Ronald Reagan actually signed a Bill of Reparations. So there is some precedent for reparations for racial minorities. So the Japanese received reparations for their internment experience in the Second World War. It was wonderful to be back in California on February 19th. There was what was called a Day of Remembrance, where we gathered in Japantown. We were able to march through Japantown, sort of recognizing all of those, everything that had happened that had led up to that day, to that time. We walked past my father's office and those storefronts as a remembrance of all that those four fathers and mothers had brought to that experience. And so we come to this present day. The rhetoric that we're hearing from our current president continues, I think, to increase the danger for Asian Americans, for example, and raise those kinds of issues that Asian Americans might be concerned about. For example, this current president wanted to establish camps for Muslim immigrants. Well, you can imagine the idea of segregating people in camps solely because of religion or because of race set off alarms within the Japanese community immediately. And I think I was pleased by the way the Japanese and actually the Asian community spoke out against the need for those camps. Distressing are the racial slurs used by our current president about a presidential candidate. And even more personally, his use of the Chinese flu and more recently, the Kung flu. As Dorothy and I were preparing to move across the country, we had heard heightened reports of anti-Asian sentiment, and indeed some not only verbal but physical attacks against Asian Americans. And so the prospect of traveling across the country, essentially on our own, was not particularly comforting. Now, we did make it. Thanks be to God, we are here and we are pleased to be back. But much of what I've said should come as no real surprise. And yet I hope that you could see through the Asian American experience that much less our words and our worldview do have a lot to do in shaping our experience, in shaping who we are, in shaping how we think and feel about the people that we come up against. Thoughts do matter, words do matter, and our actions do matter. And if you could begin by hearing the experience of someone else, someone you know, perhaps this can be a model for opening up our dialogue with others that we have yet to know, much less meet. So as United Methodists, we took a vow to renounce the spiritual forces of wickedness, reject the evil powers of this world, and repent of our sins, to accept the freedom and power God gives us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. So my prayer is that we continue to be admonished by the words of these Christian vows and the secular Declaration of Independence. I hope that we can move beyond our recitation of those vows and the familiar words of the Declaration and to make them so. Because in doing so, we become a more beloved community. We become a stronger community because we're able to listen to one another to hear the experiences that formed who we are in this time and in this place. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm looking forward to hearing what Dennis has to say. And again, thank Gene for his opening remarks. And I'll ask that God blesses all of us and these United States of America. Thank you. Dennis?
I'm on. Thank you, Mel. Am I on?
Yep.
You can hear me. Okay. I can't hear myself, obviously. Thank you, Mel, for that deep sharing. And thank you, Gene. It's my great privilege to be a part of this church as an adoptee, and privileged to be a part of your pastor's panel for these important times and in all of our lives together. I'm here to tell the story of my journey as a born and bred racist who has spent a lifetime trying to overcome it. I want to share the journey not with a list of my sins, but by calling attention to some turning points for the better in this journey. Perhaps some of you will identify with at least parts of my story. I grew up an only child in what was then a rural area that is now a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. I joined Riverside Baptist Church when I was 9. My parents, including my stepfather, who came into my life at age 9, were brought up on farms. As a result, all my relatives were either farmers or the first generation off the farm. By any modern definition, I'm sad to say, they were racists. They weren't full of hate toward people not like them, but neither did they question what they'd been taught. Simply put, white people were superior to all other races. In my growing up years, my folks owned and operated parking lots in downtown Kansas City, which has always had a sizable Black community. As a kid, when I would go to work with my dad, I was taught to be suspicious of Black people. I'm sure none were hired to work for my family. I had no classmates of color in elementary or junior high school. In 6th grade, I kissed a girl other than a relative for the first time. That was Lisbeth. We committed our planned in advance foul act behind the stage following a square dancing lesson. Now, Lisbeth was from Kentucky. In class, when the music teacher would invite us to call out songs to sing from our songbook, Lisbeth always asked for Dixie. That now banned song became my favorite song too. I also remember her repeating the slogan, "The South's gonna rise again." I'm sure I mimicked that also. No teacher intervened, or I'm sure even thought about doing so. In our high school of around 800 students, my wife Jeannie and I were high school sweethearts, by the way. There were 4 Black kids, 2 sets of brother and sister, and 1 Native American guy, Vance. My friends and I prided ourselves on being nice to them, but they were never invited to our parties, and I don't recall that they attended our school dances. I can't remember what we were taught in our history classes about the Civil War, but I'd bet my life that I was never instructed in high school or college that slavery was at the heart of the conflict. More likely, I was taught the war was about states' rights, a favorite ideological code word of racism that's still alive today in various forms. I'll fast forward through college, through our marriage in 1967, and through 1.5 years of seminary at Midwestern Baptist Seminary in Kansas City, and to my first turning point involving both racism and religion. By the winter and early spring of 1969, Jeannie and I were becoming disenchanted with the Southern Baptist denomination. Always a free thinker, I'd gotten a couple of seminary term papers back from my systematic theology professor, Dr. Morris Ashcraft, who wrote on them, "We don't think this way." He gave me A's, but kindly let me know my future wasn't going to be bright in the Baptist denomination if I kept this stuff up. At one point, I was literally one day away from calling my father-in-law, who worked for TWA, and asking him to help me get a job with the airline. That's how despairing I was about having anything to do with organized religion. But apparently God wasn't through with me yet. I chose the topic, the ecumenical movement, for a paper in Dr. Ashcraft's class. You should know that Southern Baptists, on principle, still will not cooperate much with other denominations, even by and large with other evangelicals. In my research, I came across the book Hard Rain and a Cross by L. Harold DeWolf, a Methodist professor at Boston University and advisor to Martin Luther King Jr.'s PhD dissertation. DeWolf's book completely altered my brain chemistry about what it meant to be Christian. That is to say, I came to the understanding that being Christian was more than holding to the right beliefs, that it was about self-giving, risk-taking faith, and love, and damn the status quo. Here's the book. He autographed it a few years later. A friend had him do that for me. He became dean at Wesley Seminary in DC. Reading the book also catalyzed an unease that had been fermenting for the past year since the assassination of King in April of 1968. Even with my upbringing, I'd been sort of dumbfounded by my fellow seminary students' reaction, who, while Kansas City neighborhoods were burning amidst widespread rioting, acted as if nothing of importance was happening. What also lived on in my soul were the evening television reports after King's death, in which Methodist seminary students from St. Paul's Methodist Seminary in Kansas City were shown walking with the protesters and trying to make peace. What a contrast. Accordingly, in the spring of 1969, it all came together. I did not have a home in the Southern Baptist Church. Skipping church one Sunday, Jeannie and I visited a Methodist church in Kansas City and talked with the pastor, Albert Cole. That sealed it. Within 2 months, we had left the Southern Baptist Church, joined that United Methodist Church in Kansas City, and with a letter of reference from Dr. Ashcraft, the aforementioned Baptist theology professor, enrolled in the divinity school at Duke. In July, we packed up our 1.5-year-old son, Grant, said goodbye to weeping parents who lived near us, and just before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, moved to Durham, North Carolina, to complete my Master of Divinity Studies. 1 year later, I was ordained in the Missouri West Conference. Somewhat ironically, Dr. Ashcraft himself left the Southern Baptist Convention and was a founding president of an alternative moderate Baptist denomination in 1987. What I didn't know upon entering Duke was that the Divinity School had admitted its first Black student only 4 years before, in 1965. Moreover, as it turned out, although North Carolina was a beautiful state, it was also a scary place. For example, KKK signs were common along the highways around Durham and Raleigh, and even more abundant in the rural parts. In my first semester, I took a job as youth director at Durham's wealthiest United Methodist Church. It was the church of the football coach, a slew of professors, and a whole bunch of tobacco executives. Meanwhile, in that fall of '69, the substantial Black community of Durham was trying to organize their plight. In the news was a Black minister who was often quoted. I contacted him and asked if he'd come speak to my white, privileged young people about the realities of their city. He said, sure. I mentioned it to the senior pastor, who informed me that no Black person had ever stepped inside Epworth Methodist Church, and things weren't going to change then. I was stunned. This was Methodism? When a few weeks later I proposed to bring in a speaker about the harm done by smoking, I received a similar "thou shalt not" response on behalf of the wealthy tithing tobacco executives. I quit, no doubt just before being fired. I guess that was also a turning point. I was learning a major lesson. Systemic racism is deeply ingrained in other systems, capitalism and the church. Within a year of graduation from Duke in 1971, the major turning point in my life and my family's occurred in my first appointment in Fairfield as an associate pastor. That is, we adopted Diane, a 17-month-old African-American toddler. Immediately, we lost one family in the church. Most other members of the church, however, by and large, couldn't have loved Diane or us more. The turning point in this case had to do with our self-perception as a family, a consequence we never imagined. That is, together with our then 3-year-old son, Grant, the Winkleblacks were no longer 3 all-American white people from Missouri. We were considered other by many, which is to say, worthy of suspicion. We drew second looks everywhere, some out of mere curiosity, and some with the kind of faces you make when you've sucked on a sour ball. We walked out of restaurants for non-service. We abandoned shopping trips because of overly attentive sales clerks following Diane. The instances of racism directed toward us and Diane were numerous and similar to those you've heard from Black people in recent weeks. I'll mention only a couple that still are painful to us as parents. In Kensington, where I served between 1975 and 78, a car drove by and the N-word was yelled at 6-year-old Diane, who came inside and asked what it meant. In high school, the Avon Parsonage at that time was in Unionville, when I served in Avon, of course. And while Diane was washing Daddy's car in the driveway, a car drove by and someone shouted, "Go back to Hartford." I was inside and didn't hear it. Jeannie, though, was on a small ladder trimming bushes. She leaped off and chased the car down West District Road. All I can say is, lucky for them, she didn't catch up. There are some other stories which echo what you've heard in recent weeks from people of color. No doubt, were Diane to have been a male, there would have been many more occurrences. To say the least, being a family with Diane ensured that I learned that race really matters, that being a person of color means you start every single day with a certain burden that white people can't begin to imagine. In our case, we didn't suffer financially except for the occasion when I turned down an appointment in 1978 to a much larger church in New York, whose Black and white communities were literally on opposite sides of a railroad track. We refused to subject Diane to such an environment and told the DS we were staying put. That was in the days when you didn't tell DSs that. He told me my career in the New York conference would suffer irreparably. But life went on and all has turned out fine. Being a non-white family has been a priceless education. In so many ways, we've been enabled to see the world through beautiful Black eyes, a privilege that has exceeded any imagining. The next turning point I'd mention isn't so much a moment in time, but 4 decades of immersion in the substantially non-white culture that is the New York Annual Conference. Although I served a church in Stamford that was significantly racially diverse, following Larry Snow, by the way, it has been my involvement on countless boards and committees of the conference over the years that has kept me in the company of people who don't look like me, think like me, prefer to worship like me, or usually eat what I like to eat. As you may know, the churches of our conference reflect the greatest diversity in Methodism, where people who speak multiple languages and celebrate multiple cultures call John Wesley their spiritual heir. Without a doubt, my brother and sister Methodists have helped shape me into a more aware, appreciative, inclusion-loving human being. Not least, over 14 years, I was privileged to be part of 2 cabinets led by non-white bishops, Ernest Light and Jeremiah Park. For a final turning point, or more accurately, a turning point I'm still in the middle of, we can jump to the year 2013 when Black Lives Matter was the rallying cry we heard on TV and read in the newspapers following the shooting of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman. I'd like to say I immediately got it and began to see all the world through present-day Black eyes, but that's not entirely so. Rather, it's taken the subsequent deaths of several Black people, the latest being George Floyd, to not only wake up and shake up America, but me as well. I'm now aware that more than ever in my privileged life, I must do more than work at being a non-racist person. In addition, I need to work at being anti-racist, one who helps change systems, including the church. I celebrate many things, among them that Confederate monuments are coming down, that athletic teams are changing racist nicknames. I celebrate that frontline essential workers who are disproportionately people of color, without whom we couldn't last a single day, are at least receiving attention with hope for economic equality someday. I celebrate that the young people of Simsbury successfully organized a demonstration of love and solidarity at the town hall with Simsbury's police chief. I celebrate that in general, America seems anxious to right the wrongs of our original sin of racism. I fear, however, that white, powerful Christians like me will once again find ways to skate around the present crisis and opportunity. We're real good at that. As people of privilege, we really answer to nobody. Which is to say, I fear we will once again end up talking the talk of love, but not walking the walk of love, making us, in the language of Paul writing in the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Christian pretenders who are nothing more than noisy gongs or clanging cymbals. I celebrate much, I fear much, and I pray that together, because we will really need each other to do this, we may awaken and respond with courage to the new thing I believe God is trying to do in the world. Thank you.
Wow. What a wonderful beginning on our journey together as a church to figure out more about what it means to be Christian in the world today around the topic of race and racism. Thank you so much. Once again, the three of you have blown us away and given us a piece of your history, a piece of your heart to help us to learn and grow. And we really, really appreciate that. I want to open up the Q&A at this point, and have people type in any questions you might have. You could ask a question to all panelists and ask each of the panelists to comment on their perspective on whatever your question is. You might want to know something more details about any one of the stories that were told. Or you might want to ask, a little bit more about the history that you heard. So I'm going to give everyone a moment just to use the Q&A area to type in a question. And I am seeing one that would probably go to all panelists or any panelist who knows the answer. Let's put it that way. The question is, and this relates to when we were talking about the idea of the central jurisdiction and it being reserved for folks who were different. And so the question is, well, what about other ethnic churches, like, for example, the Scandinavian Methodist churches? Were they also in the central jurisdiction?
There may be better institutional knowledge. There's almost certainly better institutional knowledge than what I have. I'm looking at you, Dennis. It may not look like I'm looking at you, but I'm looking at you. But my understanding of the central jurisdiction, and either one of you absolutely feel free to correct me, is that it was based around the idea of being a person of color, and in particular, being non-white. In which case, if that's correct, the Scandinavian Methodist Church would not apply. But I'm not positive about that. I'm not 100%, and I've done some quick looking, and I can't find anything that would indicate that they were. Do either of you know?
I do know we have had particular ethnic churches in New York City, European Scandinavian churches that were founded by immigrants and who had obviously their pastors, but they were not Black. So I would go with Jean's remembrance of that in that regard.
I think, and this is just me thinking out loud, so bear with me, but is the question underneath that question, what was the rationale that the church used to pick up these folks and put them in into their own jurisdiction. I mean, you spoke to the fact that it kept them all itinerating within their own race. What was the language and the thinking and the justification that was used at the time for this? We can look back on it now and feel like, well, that wasn't right. But then what was being said?
I think in the case of the Japanese, for example, it was the language was protective. We will put you here so that you can, excuse me, that you can grow and thrive. When in fact, I think looking back on it, it was paternalism. That we'll take care of you. And so it really wasn't until the late 60s when, in fact, the ethnic church itself was starting to to diminish, that and needed more pastors, that that the church itself changed. So once the United Methodist Church was born, we had, for example, non-Japanese pastors come. It was an interesting and challenging experience, I think, for both sides, because while there was still a sizable Japanese language population, so there were still Japanese language pastors, having non-Japanese pastors serving us was a whole new experience for the church.
Thank you, Mel.
One of the things, and Dennis, serving on the cabinet, you would certainly be able to speak to this, but one of the things that as clergy that we're all called to do in the Methodist Church, and especially as Dennis pointed out, and we're aware, is that the New York Annual Conference is considered to be one of, if not the most diverse annual conference in the entire Methodist organization, period, full stop, not just in this country, but anywhere you go. And we are called to be able to itinerate, to move from church to church in cross-cultural and cross-racial appointments. This was not an idea that existed when the central jurisdiction happened. And I appreciate Mel's comment that it was probably at best, if you were to couch it in the best terms, that it was a sense of paternalism, of taking care of and creating a safe space. And there is writing around the formation of the central jurisdiction that indicates that the thinking in 1939 was something along those lines. It will be safer, it will be better, you will be more comfortable, pastor who looks like you, who sounds like you. And what we would think of this in terms of education, Brown versus Board of Education, for example, from 1954 would be separate but equal. The reality of it is that it was never really equal, though it may have been separate. And when the central jurisdiction ended officially in 1968, there was some conversation around that loss of autonomy, the ability to make their own elections and selections and to run things the way that they wanted to, because now everybody is together, and so you have less local autonomy. On the other hand, that did not override or dissuade folks who were involved in being part of the central jurisdiction, at least in the case of a lot of the reading that I did for tonight, from wanting to be a part of the United Methodist Church, of wanting to see the central jurisdiction go away. What's interesting is that the central jurisdiction, the terminology stuck around, and it became how we refer to any of the Methodist churches that are not based in North America. They are in what is known as the central conferences. So we changed the terminology slightly, but if you go to a church in Germany, if you go to a church in the Philippines, if you go to a church anywhere else around the world, you are part of what is known as the central conferences. And it's interesting to note that there has been some conversation around whether or not that's appropriate. So, in a sense, everything that's old is new again, and we're still kind of having similar conversations.
it punctuates the point that Dennis brought up earlier, and that is that no matter what the reason was, whether it was kind-hearted and protective, paternalistic, or whether, the reason was, let's just keep these people who are different away from each other. It goes to show that systemic racism, but when it's institutionalized and baked into the way that we organize ourselves and the rules that we make, the church is not excluded and hasn't been. Mm-hmm. So thank you for sharing that. We have another question, and this one goes to you too, Mel. So have another drink of water. And this one is, can you tell us about your experience as you became a trained hospital chaplain? This individual is remembering you expressing concern about walking into the various hospital rooms and how people might react to the different look that you have.
In fact, I do remember talking about that and being self-conscious about being a visibly identifiable minority, such that literally walking into a room sets up a whole system of expectations. I think what I had learned over time is that being God's presence, any difference quickly faded in the face of a need to be heard, a need for prayer, a need for just having God present in the room. And so I think what I've learned over time is that initial difference is now mitigated by who you are in the room.
Great, thank you for that. Another question, someone has expressed concern, this would probably go to all panelists for your perspective. Someone has expressed concern about the United Methodist Cross and Flame logo, and that it looks like a burning cross. And the asker is wondering if there's been any discussion at the conference level on our church logo and how it might be frightening to people or putting people off.
It's certainly a wrong symbol to have at this time in our life together. However, it was originally conceived. I don't know if anyone anywhere is discussing it, given that we're not sure what denomination any of us are going to be a part of in a year or two. Hopefully we can choose again. That's my thought.
I think it's a relevant question. And certainly as we explore new ways of being, new ways of identifying, as Dennis has said, and of course, the last time the three of us were together talking to you, we were talking about that very thing. What's going to happen with human sexuality and gender identity? How is this going to look? And of course, COVID-19 put a pause on that too, and we'll pick that up in 2021. But for me, this emblem comes out of that 1968 unification. And so that means that it is now, 52 years old at least, right? And, in the life of an institution, that can be a very, very long time. And of course, in the times that we're living through, it takes on another significance that I don't think anyone in 1968 was thinking about, although perhaps they should have been. And so, one of the things that I would suggest, and I haven't heard any conversation at the conference level. I think that there have been other conversations going on, which is not to say this isn't important. One of the things that is beloved to me about being United Methodist is that as a layperson, we have the ability to raise those questions. We have the ability to petition for change. It doesn't just come from clergy. And that is something that I hold really, really dear. And so to that person who's wondering about that, there are ways to raise that level of consciousness at a conference level. And if the conference thinks it's important enough, there are ways to pass that along to the entire Methodist Church. And I think that's a really valid question. And I would encourage them to investigate that.
Mel, anything you would add to what the other two panelists remarked on this one?
No, I think I appreciate the fact that Jean puts it in an historical perspective. It is a 50-year-old symbol. And as we're starting to ask questions about some contemporary symbols, particularly in terms of sports teams, it's appropriate to ask some questions about what are the symbols that we're using. I know the Wesley Covenant group, who may be one of the major people who move out of the United Methodist Church, have already struggled with what's going to be their symbol. And so they're using a cross with 3 books and 1 open book that they say represents the Bible. So they're struggling. I suspect we will and should struggle ourselves.
Thank you very much for that. There's a follow-up question to that saying, well, what would we do if our particular church wanted to take the symbol off of our page so as not to convey the concerns that the asker was mentioning?
I would love to have that conversation come up at church council. I think that'd be an appropriate place to start, and I think that I'm sure that the person asking has some really valid concerns. Certainly, you know, us taking part in this conversation have some idea about where that conversation is coming from. Dennis's comments about coming to Durham, North Carolina, and seeing, you know, roadside billboard signs advertising for the Klan, I mean, still send chills down my spine. I would point out that when I went down to school in South Carolina, in the year 2000, the summer that I got there for my sophomore year of college, there were 3 racially motivated church burnings the first month I was down there. And of course, the Confederate Stars and Bars naval ensign that most of us recognize from the roof of the General Lee and the Dukes of Hazzard, and certainly that's been in conversation and was just recently removed from the state flag in Mississippi, was still flying over the dome of the State House in Columbia, South Carolina. So of course, I'm also aware that that was 20 years ago now, but that's not that long ago. And so I would recommend that person send that to Jennifer Atchison, who's our church council chair, and say, listen, I'd love to be on the agenda. I'd like some time to talk about this. I think it's something that we as a church need to examine. Again, take advantage of being a layperson and move that forward and allow the church, in this case, SUM, to debate that. And I would say further, and I'll make an assumption, which is dangerous, that this is the same person who asked the foregoing question. That would give more oomph to any kind of motion that you would make to the annual conference. If you could say, and my home church has taken this up as something that we think is important.
Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
There is a question that goes to all panelists. It's more of a pondering or a perspective that you have on the words white privilege. And so the question is, how would you respond to someone who is questioning that white privilege exists?
I'll go first. So I've thought a lot about this, and one of the things that's been really interesting is during this time having conversations with members of my own family who absolutely cringe at that expression, who feel that it is just so inappropriate and so offensive and hurtful to them. And the reason for this is that they're not wealthy, they're not well-to-do, they work very, very hard 6 days a week, they give you the shirt off their backs, and they honestly believe that everything that they have gained through hard work. They don't see any privilege to being white. And in fact, sometimes they look around and they see people of color who are doing far better than they are in all sorts of venues, entertainment and sports and all kinds of stuff. And to them, that seems like an incredible privilege, rather than a cousin of mine who's a diesel mechanic and spends his days in all sorts of weather in mud and snow and ice and hydraulic fluid. It doesn't sound like he's privileged at all. And so this is a tough conversation to have. So what I would point out to you is that there are a couple of instances where I am acutely aware of the fact that by virtue of who I am relative to some other instances that we've all read and heard about, that I seem to have escaped absolutely scot-free, and I am left to wonder about why that might have been. So they all revolve around traffic stops.
Amen.
And so I would tell you that while I have never had the privilege to speak to the Simsbury Police Department by the roadside, and I hope to continue that, I have had numerous traffic stops at other places, New York State Police, local town police, and for a variety of things. You know, some of them, in all honesty, speeding. One of them, I blew through a red light, didn't realize it, and was pulled over for running a red light. And one of the ones that still causes me deep concern is when I was down as a student in South Carolina, and I had an old car. I had a 1968 Buick convertible. It had parts off it, and in South Carolina at the time, you were allowed to put a piece of cardboard on your license plate and say tags applied for because you were not issued your tags by the DMV. So it is. I was out driving and I had gone to pick up a part. I was away. I was an hour away from Columbia. I was out in the country in South Carolina, and I was pulled over by a South Carolina state trooper. Needless to say, as someone holding a New York state driver's license, I was concerned. It was a known fact, and I had run into people who, when they found out that I was a, quote, Yankee, were very surprised. The gentleman who sold me the car initially had second thoughts about selling me the car because he wanted to know if I was going to take it back to New York. He was not happy about that. And so I was really worried. To make a long story short, despite a lack of safety equipment, despite an improperly set speedometer, I had been pulled over for speeding, but I promise you I was unaware of it. Despite some other flagrant moving violations as the result of driving an old car that I was in the process of restoring, I was allowed to go scot-free, never asked to step from the vehicle, never asked to provide any more than normal information, never held for an excessive period of time on the roadside, and never once in fear for my life, although it took me some time for my heart rate to resume. And at the time, being a dumb 21-year-old, I didn't think too much about that. But I think that what we have seen is that all too often things go sideways in traffic stops. And I've wondered at all of those, how much of that was the fact that I was a clean-shaven, fairly upstanding white person who had been pulled over. Did that make a difference? Is that why? I think so. And I'm not proud of that. And when I think about white privilege, the reality of it is that I didn't ask for any of that. I didn't ask for special treatment. It didn't have anything to do about what I did or what I didn't do. And in fact, most of the time, in full confession, I had broken the law and I was let go. So there are those moments where, because of the color of my skin, I don't worry. I have never once had to talk about how Isaac should be respectful and thoughtful to people in authority outside of just general politeness. That's known as the talk. I've never had to give my kids the talk. And so there is a degree of privilege there that you don't need to worry about. So that's kind of a long explanation, but I understand the struggle with it. I go through it with members of my own family, and yet at the same time, I am forced to look at myself and some of the situations. And I'm not suggesting that I wanted a ticket, that I wanted to have to step out of the car, that no. But at the same time, I received things that I did not ask for by virtue of who I am.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Gene. I want to give either Dennis or Mel or both an opportunity to build upon it or offer to shape it from your own thoughts and perspective.
Well, I would just point out kind of what I said before. I think, and everyone has alluded to it, it's a daily awareness of needing to be on guard and careful that I've never experienced. But I'm talking about daily. And certainly anytime you walk on a street, and this is even before some of the police violence has come to the light in recent days. And just living with that, that creates hypertension just in that daily having to think about it, just having to think about it. And so that is a huge part of white privilege. I think we can talk about the economic advantages. White people are going to be hired before people of color because most of the people doing hiring are white business owners and white people, and you tend to know more white people, and you tend to want to hire people that kind of look like you. I think that is what goes on. So I think we can go on and on and on. But for those who struggle economically, who work as hard as anyone, as Jean was referencing, you know, I think it's the biggest difference between them and still gives them white privilege is when they go out with their hard-earned dollars for a night on the town, they don't have to give a second thought to, oh my God, what happens if? They don't even think about it. And I think a person of color pretty much always has to be aware of that. And I just think that builds up internal stuff that's got to shorten your lifespan.
Thank you.
Let me just build a little bit on what actually both of them said. That I think privilege in one sense is almost a state of mind. That is to say, it's less than conscious, so that there can be not only racial privilege, but also economic privilege. To be in a financial state where you don't have to consider some of the issues that people do just by getting up in the morning and having to live their lives. So that if our challenge is to become aware of that state of mind, of that privilege, so that we might be in a position to be able to do something about it, or to respond differently. So it's not as much, I guess, as, you know, white privilege as it is, who are we and how do we see ourselves in relationship to other people?
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask each panelist for the ways that you have turned to deepen your understanding and learn more in these days. I know we're all seeking to learn more. That's why we're here tonight. I know that someone jotted down in the Q&A that, you know, there's a whole book on white privilege that's been made famous written by a white woman, Robin DiAngelo, called White Fragility. Many people are reading that book. I've watched some of her TED Talks. At Travelers, where I report to the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, we are reading the book, We Can't Talk About That at Work, subtitled How to Talk About Race, Religion, Politics, and Other Polarizing Topics. And many of the things that you have brought up tonight about it being about relationship and who shows up in the room, Mel, are discussed, you know, as to an entering point for being able to have those conversations. I have a stack this high on you know, my nightstand that I am trying to make myself, trying to get through, I should say, not make myself, trying to get through. And I'm sure you do as well. And as you think a bit more about one or two that you'd like to share, I want to reassure everyone that's on the session tonight that we will be coming out with a resource list, much like we did when we were trying to learn more and deepen our understanding on human sexuality. We're culling through it right now because it's very, very long. And we want to, you know, just sort of pick a few videos, a few movies, a few books to recommend to you to start. So I hope that gave you guys enough time to recommend what you would like to, what you've read or what has struck you that the folks are curious.
I have a couple of books. I'm wading my way through one now that is upsets me on just about every page. On one page, it upsets me to realize how hard it is to be an African American. On the other page, it upsets me because I'm not sure I get it. But I'm going to school on it. I think it's one of the bestsellers called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. I'm looking at my Kindle page, Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi. It's a hard book to read. It's a hard book to read. The other book that has not gotten a lot of attention, but I think it's a year or two old, called Waking Up White by a woman named Debbie Irving. I think that's a good book. And then the one that we may do a study on by the founder of Sojourners, Jim Wallis, called America's Original Sin. Jim Wallis is a white Protestant pastor. And I think there's, for folks who haven't read a whole lot about this, I think that's a pretty good book to begin.
Thanks, Dennis.
I was thinking about two books initially myself. One is by Malcolm Gladwell uh, called Talking to Strangers. And what he posits in the book is that we tend to be hardwired as to approaching people who are not like us. And we were talking about privilege earlier. It's one of the factors that tends to kick in when we approach somebody who's not like us. And so what Gladwell talks about are what are the ways that we can begin to open ourselves up to a dialogue with people who aren't like us. So Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. And then I'm not sure why it popped into my head, except that it might be part of what Gene and Dennis were talking about, was Hillbilly Elegy.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about a person who grew up in Appalachia, ultimately went on to attend Yale Law School, but it is his experience and understanding of what it meant to grow up as a hillbilly. And so here is an experience of, quote, white America that is entirely out of the mainstream white privilege that we tend to fall back on, and exactly the kind of group who would just recoil in horror at the thought that, what are you talking about? I don't have white privilege. So the Hillbilly Elegy came to my mind as well.
Thank you, Mel.
I think those are fantastic lists, and so I'm just gonna throw a couple names out and then kind of get to where I want to be. And one of the things is that as a history major, as an undergraduate in college, and almost all of the history that I read, that I was assigned to read, that I learned, that I wrote term papers on, was all written by white people. And so it wasn't really until I got to seminary and went to Drew Theological, where I was surrounded by a student body that was more non-white than white, roughly 50% from Korea or Korean American, and then a scattering of other folks, where I sat in classrooms with people from Liberia, Ghana, Kenya, and New Jersey, where the school was, and New York and other places like that. That I was exposed to some really wonderful Black thinkers like Tandeka and Bell Hooks. And so that really kind of fostered some curiosity on my part, because it was, in many ways, it was the same history, but it's a different perspective, and there is that expression: anytime that you have a conversation, there are at least 3 points of view. There's yours, there's the other person, and then there's what happened. And that was really a revelation for me. The books that I've read recently that have really struck me, Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, recognizing that racism, institutional racism, civil rights are multifaceted. That's mostly being about the judicial system and about prisons. And currently, the two books that I just finished, one is called, let's see, I pulled it up because I always get it wrong, Seeing My Skin. It's a story of wrestling with whiteness. It's written by Peter Jarrett Schnell. He is a pastor. He is married to an African-American woman. They have a biracial child. And it is a collection of essays about his experiences throughout the course of his life. He's roughly a peer of mine, age-wise, of times that he did not recognize his privilege as a white man in this country. And the book that I'm reading, and this goes to Mel's point about Malcolm Gladwell, I'm reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me right now. And it is a stunning, beautiful, difficult book to read, because it is a letter. It is posed as a letter that he is writing to his son. It's poetic. It's a gut punch. Not a very big book, and just absolutely beautiful in getting an eyeball into a completely different world of growing up as an African-American man in a really rough section of Baltimore, and how that desire to, as he says, protect his body influenced so much of his thinking. So I'd recommend Seeing My Skin, Peter Jarrett Schnell, and then Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Well, thank you very much, each of you, and to everyone who spent their evening together. One of the things we know is that we learn better through relationship, and this is the way to start, with learning more about the stories that these three people chose to share with us this evening. And there will be more opportunities. As I said, next week we are going to have another webinar, and it'll be more educational as to the history of racism and some definitions that you still may be wondering about. We hope to see you back at that point as well. I have put the survey link into the chat bar. And this is a way you can comment to us on what you liked about this evening, how you wished it was different, whether or not you're interested in next week's webinar. So please feel free to click on that while the evening is still fresh. You just have to open up the chat bar and click on that link. If for some reason you miss it, we will send it to you. And that is all my way of saying I'm going to stop speaking and ask Pastor Jean to close us out with a prayer and a few thoughts about the evening.
Thanks, Deb. I just want to underscore what a pleasure it is to be able to partner in ministry with you on a regular basis. And what a blessing it is to be with two of my real mentors and pastor heroes. I don't think either one of them would be comfortable with me saying that, but there it is. It's true. And so it's good just to be able to be with you two and to be walking all of these journeys together. I started with quoting Bishop Bickerton, and I kind of want to end with him, and then I'll end with a prayer. He writes at the end of his letter from the 26th of June, quote, "I know that there are those who do not agree with this approach being learning and speaking about racism, and others who do not sense the need. I hear from those persons frequently. Still, we must not allow that to deter us from the urgency of this need. We must press on to freedom. And indeed, that is what we will attempt to do with intentionality and purpose." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once wrote, quote, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. There is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action," end quote. And so I invite you with those words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spent 2 summers in Simsbury and had some of his experiences influence his later actions, and of course is familiar to all of us, as those ring in our hearts and in our ears. Would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, once again, we, the people of Simsbury United Methodist, we, the people of Simsbury and the larger community, we, the people of the state of Connecticut, we, the people of the great United States of America, enter onto and into a new journey, a journey to make these truths which we hold to be self-evident real for all, to allow the light to shine that came forth in Independence Hall, the hopes of those who believed things in their hearts that maybe were hard for them to walk in their personal lives. God, we pray that by telling those stories, by inquiring of those historical figures and events in our past, both as a nation and as a church and as individuals, we would not allow it to dim the possibility, but that we would allow ourselves to live into the reality that we are all wonderfully and fearfully born, that we are all complicated, that we all bring pain and burdens and sorrow, that we all have much to learn from each other. And that through that, with your help, God, we have the potential for so much more. We pray all of this in your loving name. Amen.
Amen.
With that, we say good night and thank you again to our panelists. Good night, everyone.